Cleansing the Doors of Perception by Huston Smith. The Sacred Unconscious. That a great deal of what goes on in our minds is out of sight is beyond question. Much of our knowledge gets programmed into neural pathways in ways that we neither perceive nor understand in detail. Thus, I rightly say that I know how to ride a bicycle and to type using the touch system, but I am not aware of the workings of this tacit knowledge, as Michael Polanyi christened it, tacit knowledge, in quotes. Atop this physiologically impounded knowledge is the storehouse of memories that can be recalled but are otherwise not in full view. Fragments from the storehouse often arise uninvited through free associations. Psychologists study the pathways these associations lay down in our early years, and they help us understand ways in which those pathways influence our responses for the rest of our lives. The totality of these pathways constitutes the individual consciousness each of us possesses. Individual, because no childhood duplicates another. To that individual unconsciousness, Marx added a social unconsciousness, for our position in the social hierarchy also influences the way we see things. Reading this paragraph backward, we can say that the West has identified three well-delineated unconsciousnesses. A social consciousness, which is constructed by our place in society, an individual unconsciousness, which is our individual childhood experiences, and a physiological unconsciousness, which impounds our tacit knowledge. Learning about these three layers of unconscious minds has proved useful, but there is a problem. Set within the scientific worldview, which sees the mind as having evolved from what lacks mind, they do not provide us with a very inspiring image of ourselves. Artists tend to see this most clearly, and I will quote one of the most discerning among them, Saul Bellow, speaking of the contractual daylight view of ourselves that psychologists, sociologists, historians, and journalists have moved into place. Bellow, in his 1976 Nobel Prize address, says, "The images that come to us in this contractual daylight, so boring to all of us, originate in the contemporary worldview. We put into our books the consumer, civil servant, football fan, lover, television viewer, and in the contractual daylight version, their life is a kind of death. There is another life coming from an insistent sense of what we are that denies these daylight formulations, the false life, the death in life. They make for us. For it is false, and we know it, and our secret and incoherent resistance to it cannot stop, for that resistance arises from persistent intuitions. Perhaps humankind cannot bear too much reality, but neither can it bear too much unreality, too much abuse of truth." In this context, Roger Walsh and Deanne Shapiro, Beyond Health and Normality, Explorations of Exceptional Psychological Well-Being, comes like a burst of fresh air. As psychiatrists, Walsh and Shapiro are aware of just how much Freud contributed to the boring, contractual daylight model of the self that Saul Bellows recounts. But they couldn't stop there. Nothing that the complete edition of the collected works of Sigmund Freud contained, over 400 entries for neurosis and none for health. They go on to point out that Freud was a physician and that physicians deal with sick patients. Freud dealt with the sick unconsciousnesses. Walsh and Shapiro ask us to effect Walsh and Shapiro ask us, in effect, to turn this on its head by trying to imagine what a model of the human self might look like if its database numbered saints rather than neurotics. I shall use the second half of this essay to address that question directly, but because saints constitute a small sample of the human population, I shall begin more neutrally by proposing a model of the human mind that holds for human beings generally, and work from there to the supreme actualization it allows for. Among other virtues in the paragraph by Saul Bellow that I quoted in its recognition that self-images are shaped by the world views that prompt them, so I will say in a sentence what it is in the traditional and modern worldviews, that causes them to generate opposing anthropological models. Modernity sees humanity as having ascended from what is inferior to it. Life begins in slime and ends in intelligence, whereas traditional cultures see it as descended from its superiors. As the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins, Sahlins, puts the matter, we are the only people who assume that we have ascended from apes. Everyone else takes it for granted that they are descended from gods. I shall be tapping here into the Indian account of this divine lineage, which traditional peoples universally assumed, and a vivid memory takes me directly to the heart of that account. In 1970, while conducting 30 students around the world for an academic year to study cultures on location, I availed myself of my professional friendship with a distinguished philosopher at the University of Madras, T.M.P. Mahadevan, Mahadevan, to ask him to speak to my students. I felt awkward about the invitation, for I assigned him an impossible task: to explain to neophytes in one short morning how Indian philosophy differed from Western philosophy. I needed have been concerned, for he rose to the occasion effortlessly, beginning with a sentence that I remember verbatim for the scope it covered. He said, matter-of-factly, Indian philosophy differs from Western in that Western philosophers philosophize from a single state of consciousness, the waking state, whereas India philosophizes from them all. From that arresting beginning, he went on to explain that India sees waking consciousness as one state among four, the other three being the dream state, the state of dreamless sleep, and a final state that is so far from our waking consciousness that it is simply referred to as the fourth. I pass over the fact that it is only in the last 50 years that the West has taken serious notice of the difference between dream and dreamless sleep, which difference yogis have worked with for millennia. What is important is not the time scale, but the different ways that two civilizations characterize dreamless sleep. The West does not assume that it includes awareness, whereas India holds that we are more intensely aware, that we are then more intensely aware than we are when we are awake or dreaming. Let me read that sentence again. Okay. The West does not assume that it includes awareness, whereas India holds that we are then more intensely aware than we are when we are awake or dreaming. Okay. I battled my Vedanta teacher for 7 years over this issue. I, claiming that I was not aware while sleeping dreamlessly, and he insisting that I was aware. When I pointed out that I certainly wasn't aware that I was aware, he dismissed my post as sophomoric. I think how rapidly even your dreams evaporate. He said most of them don't survive until morning. That much I had to grant him, and he went on to press his advantage. Dreamless sleep transpires in a far deeper stratum of the mind than dreams occur, he said. So it stands to reason that years of yogic attention are required to bring its content back to wakeful memory. And what the yogis report is that dreamless sleep is a state of bliss. Bliss so intense, in fact, that it is exceeded only by the fourth state of consciousness, wherein Atman, which is the self's foundation, merges with Brahman. Were it not for the fact that we recharge our batteries every 24 hours by experiencing this bliss of dreamless sleep, my teacher concluded, the trials and disappointments of daily life would wear us down and we would give up on life. My Swami and I ran out his clock in this deadlock, but several years after he died, something happened that brought me around to his position. To have my wisdom teeth extracted, I was administered total anesthesia, and in the improbable circumstances of a cramped recovery room with a nurse shaking me to return me to wakefulness, I heard myself exclaiming, "Oh, so beautiful!" Even as I pronounced these words, my grip on the experience had slipped to the point that I could no longer remember what it was that was beautiful. But that it was beautiful, staggeringly so, I can remember so vividly that to this day it continues to send chills up my spine. When I report the incident to one of my daughters, when I reported the incident to one of our daughters, she said that the same thing had happened to her, only her first words were, "I love you," professed to a total stranger. "I am so happy," was the variation a third party reported, while a fourth acquaintance reported, "That is so neat," was the best his high school vocabulary could manage in describing the experience when it occurred to him. The question this raises is, what prompted those ecstatic, and I use the word advisedly, those ecstatic utterances in their respective modes of beauty, love, and bliss? Three faces of God or the good? I omit neat because of its adolescent vagueness. Clearly nothing that was going on in the empirical world. My own conclusion is that all three were reports from the state of dreamless sleep, that the anesthetics had transported their patients to, and whose importance my Swami had been trying to persuade me of. India's model of the mind incorporates these three states of consciousness in a way that positions them, figuratively speaking, as Chinese boxes. Atman, the pure, effulgent, undiluted consciousness that is our existence, is encased in what the Indians call the causal body, which we experience in deep sleep. This, in turn, nestles in the subtle body, which facilitates dreams, and that, in turn, is housed in the gross body, which generates wakeful experience. As the pure light of the void works its way through these boxes, which in Sanskrit are called sheaths, and which in many traditions are referred to as veils. It grows progressively dimmer, and we are brought back to the fundamental difference between the traditional and modern models of the mind that I previously mentioned. Modernity sees the mind as having risen from what is inferior to it, whereas traditional people see it as deriving from what is greater than itself, carrying within itself traces of its noble ancestry. Even today we hear echoes of this traditional less for more model of the mind in voices like those of Wordsworth. Trailing clouds of glory, we come from heaven, our home. Eddington, who concluded that the world is more like a mind than a machine. Schrödinger, who likened it to Brahman, infinite being, infinite awareness, and infinite bliss. And Bergson, who considered the mind a reducing valve. But I must move on to the second half of this essay, having called attention to seemingly insuperable problems that plague the modern model of the mind, and following that by dubbing in Vedantic idiom the basics of the generic traditional model. I turn now to the direct object of Walsh and Shapiro's book, which is to explore possibilities of extreme psychological well-being. What kind of a person does the traditional model of selfhood allow for at its best? It is easier to describe flawed instances of the model than perfected ones, for those are the only instances we actually encounter. Even Christ asked rhetorically, "Why callest thou me good? Why callest thou me good?" Paradoxically, these tarnished instances are our best resource for trying to imagine a perfected one, as the tragic flaw theory of art attests. No playwright would dream of trying to create a perfect hero, for matched with real life, he would appear as bogus, as a cardboard cutout. But Endo, the hero, with a fatal weakness. Hamlet's indecision is the classic example, and the reader will supply the missing virtue instinctively. Master psychologist that he was, the Buddha anticipated this tragic flaw device by 25 centuries. He never played to the galleries with previews of coming attractions, tantalizing descriptions of what nirvana would feel like. What he hammered at was the three poisons that stand in its way: greed, hatred, and delusion. Human egos that result from the veilings of the three sheaths are shot through with these poisons. Interests and thoughts normally extend outward, but our egos work like magnets to bend them back in U-turns unto ourselves. This creates a hotspot of being that hugs us tightly. Things that concern us directly we view with feverish intensity, while regarding those at a distance with cold indifference. Our glasses are prescription ground to cause us to see things our way. It's as the Tibetans say, when a pickpocket meets a saint, what he sees is his pockets. More poignantly, when poor children are asked to draw a penny, they draw it larger than do children for whom pennies are commonplace. It looms larger in their mind's eye. What we take to be objective facts are largely psychological constructs, as the Latin factum, that which is made, reminds us. The conclusion is inescapable. Our normal self is little more than an amalgam of desires and aversions that we have wound around it as tightly as the elastic of a golf ball. The tight, constricted golf ball itself is in for hard knocks, but what concerns me here is that, on average, it doesn't feel very good. Anxiety hovers over it. It can feel victimized and grow embittered. It is easily disappointed and become unstrung. To others, it often appears no prettier than it feels to itself. Petty, self-centered, drab, and bored. I am deliberately putting down this golf ball self, hurling it to the ground, as it were, to see how high our total self can bounce, how far toward heaven it can ascend. In order to ascend, it must break out of the hard rubber strings of our attachments that we have stretched so tightly around it. If we change our image from rubber to glass and picture the three poisons as a lens that refracts light waves in the direction of our private, importunate demands, freedom from these egocentric distortions will come, progressively decreasing our lens's curve, reducing its bulge. The logical terminus of this would be clear glass. Through this glass, we would be able to see things objectively, as they are in their own right. This clear glass, which for purposes of vision is equivalent to no glass at all, is our sacred unconsciousness. It is helpful to think of it as an absence because, like window glass, it functions best when it calls no attention to itself. And it is precisely this absence that makes the world available to us. The less there is of self, the more there is of self. Oh, just a minute. Okay, open quote. The less there is of self, small s, the more there is of self, capital S, close quote, as Meister Eckhart said. The less there is of self, the more there is of self. From clear glass, we have moved to no glass, the removal of everything that might separate object from object, self from the world. Zen Buddhists use this image of a great round mirror. When the obscuring deposits of the three poisons are removed from it, it reflects the world just as it is. To claim that human consciousness can move permanently into this condition probably goes too far, but advances along the asymptotic curve that slopes in its direction are clearly perceptible. When our aversion lens is bloated, humping towards a semicircle, we like very little that comes our way. The same holds, of course, for our desire lens, which is then the convex side of aversion's concave arc. The more it distorts our evaluations towards our own self-interests, the less energy remains to appreciate things in their own right. Blake's formulation of the alternative to this self-centered outlook has become a classic. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. The fully realized human being is one of those doors of perception that have been cleansed. I have myself referred to these doors as windows and envisioned them as successive layers of our unconscious mind. Those that are near the surface vary from person to person, for they are deposited by our idiosyncratic childhood experiences. At some level, though, they encounter the three poisons, once again, desire, aversion, and ignorance, that are common to humankind, and to some degree may be necessary for us to function as individuals. But the deepest layer I have suggested is really a no layer, for being a glass door ajar, or a mirror that discloses other things than itself, it effectively isn't there. Even if it were there, in what sense would we call it ours? When we look toward it, we see simply world. This opening out onto the world's infinity is one good reason for calling this deepest stratum of the mind sacred, for surely holiness has something to do with the whole. But the concreteness of Blake's formulation is instructive. He doesn't tell us that a cleansed perception discloses the infinite per se. It finds it in things at hand, in keeping with the Buddhist teaching that the most sacred scriptures are in unwritten pages. An old pine tree, gnarled by wind and weather, or a skein of geese traversing the autumn sky. Thus far, I have defined a realized human being, what the Indians call a Jivamukta, Jivamukta. It remains to describe one. What would it feel like to be such a person? And how would one appear to others? Basically, she lives in the unvarying presence of the numerous. That does not mean that she is excited or hyped. Her condition has nothing to do with the adrenaline flow or manic states that call for depressive ones to balance the emotional account. It's more like what Kipling had in mind when he said of one of his characters, he believed that all things were one big miracle. And when a man knows that much, he knows something to go upon. The opposite of the sense of the sacred, is not serenity or sobriety. It is drabness, taken for granted, lack of interest, the ho-hum, the prosaic, the deadly sin of acedia. All other attributes of a related being must be relativized against this one absolute. An acute sense of the astonishing mystery of everything. Everything else we say of him must have a yes, no quality. Is he always happy? Well, yes and no. On one level, he is emphatically not. If he were, he couldn't weep with those who mourn. He would be an unfeeling monster, a callous brute. If anything, a realized soul is much more in touch with the grief and sorrow that is part and parcel of the human condition, knowing that it too needs to be accepted and lived as all life needs to be lived. To reject the shadow side of life and pass it by with averted eyes, refusing our share of common sorrow while expecting our share of common joy, would cause the utilized, closed-off shadows in us to deepen to fear, including the fear of death. A story that's told in the recent Zen master Shaku Soen, Shakusoen, points up the dialectic stance of the realized soul towards happiness. I am nothing. I'm going to read that sentence again. A story that is told of the recent Zen master Shakuson points up the dialectic stance of the realized soul toward the happiness. I am nothing. Oh, I am noting. Sorry. The happiness I am noting. Okay, now it makes sense. In the evening, he liked to take a stroll through the outskirts of the village. One evening, he heard wailing in a house that he was passing, and on entering quietly, he found the householder had died, and his family and neighbors were crying. Immediately, he sat down and started weeping with them. An elderly gentleman, shaken by this display of emotion by an accomplished master, berated him. I thought you were beyond this kind of thing, he said indignantly. Through his sobs, the master managed to falter. It is this that puts me beyond them. It is this that puts me beyond it. The master's tears we can understand. The sense in which he was beyond them is more difficult, it being the peace that passeth understanding. The peace that passeth understanding. The peace that comes when man is hungry and finds food, is sick and recovers, or is lonely and finds a friend. Peace of this sort is incomprehensible, but the peace that passeth understanding comes when the pain of life is not relieved. It shimmers on the crest of a wave of pain. It is the spear of frustration transformed into a shaft of light. But the peace that passeth understanding comes when the pain of life is not relieved. It shimmers on the crest of a wave of pain. It is the spear of frustration transformed into a shaft of light. The master's sobs were real, yet paradoxically, they did not erode the yes experience of the East. It is as it should be, and the West's, thy will be done. To our efforts to conceive the human best, everything turns on an affirmation that steers between cynicism on the one hand and sentimentality on the other. A realized self isn't incessantly and oppressively cheerful. Oppressively, not only because we suspect some disassembling in his unvarying smile, but because it underscores our moodiness by contrast. Not every room a jiva mukta enters floods with light. He can flash anger and upset money changers' tables. Not invariance, but appropriateness is his hallmark. An appropriateness that has the whole repertoire of emotions at its command. The Catholic Church is right in linking radiance with sanctity, but the paradoxical, in spite of character, of this radiance must again be stressed. Along with being a gift to be received, life is a task to be performed. The adept performs it. Whatever her hand finds to do, she does it with a will, even if it proves her lot to walk stretches of life as a desert waste. She walks it rather than pining for its alternative. Happiness enters as a byproduct. What matters focally, as the Zen master Dogen never tired of noting, is resolve. If a Jiva Mukta isn't forever radiating sweetness and light, neither does he constantly emit blasts of energy. He can be forceful when he needs to be. We find it restoring rather than draining to be around him. And he has reserves to draw on, as when Socrates stood all night in trance and outpaced the militia with bare feet on ice. In general, though, we sense him as composed rather than changed. The model of the dynamic and magnetic personality tends to have a lot of ego in it, for needing to be noticed. Remember, everything save the adept's access to inner vistas, the realms of gold I am calling the sacred unconscious, must be relativized. If leadership is called for, he steps forward. If not, he is pleased to follow. He isn't debarred from being a guru, but he doesn't need disciples to prop up his ego. Focus or periphery, limelight or shadow, it really doesn't matter. Both have their opportunities, both the demands they exact. All these relativities that I have mentioned, happiness, energy, prominence, impact, pertain to the Jiva Mukta's finite self, which she progressively pushes aside as she makes her way toward her sacred unconscious. As her goal is an impersonal, impartial one, her identification with it involves a dying to her finite selfhood. Part of her being is engaged in a perpetual vanishing act. As Kumaraswamy suggested when he wrote, "Blessed is the man on whose tomb can be written, Hic jacet nemo, here lies no one." But having insisted that there is only one absolute or constraint, But having insisted that there is only one absolute or constant in the journey towards self-knotting, namely the sense of the sacred, that luminous mystery in which all things are bathed, I must now conclude that there is one other, the realization of how far we are all from the goal that beckons. How many precipices must yet be climbed? As human beings, we are created to surpass ourselves, and are truly ourselves only when transcending ourselves. Only the slightest of barriers separates us from our sacred unconsciousness. It is infinitely close to us, but we are infinitely far from it. So for us, the barrier looms as a mountain that we must dig through with bare hands. We scrape away at the earth, but in vain the mountain remains. Still we go on, digging at the mountain in the name of God, or whatever, of the final truth. We, for the most part, only hear. Rarely do we experience it. The mountain isn't there. It never was there. And that concludes Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is entitled Contemporary Evidence, Psychiatry and the Work of Stanislav Grof.